left off. And that's with the United States Constitution, which should be the North Star for every senator in this body, regardless of party. And that's why I rise in support of this bipartisan resolution, barring U.S. military action within or against Venezuela without congressional authorization. I think it's always helpful just to read the words of some of these resolutions, and the one we're debating right now is S.J. Res. 90, joint resolution to direct the removal of United States armed forces from hostilities within or against Venezuela that have not been authorized by Congress. A pretty straightforward statement of what the Constitution requires, because Article 1 of the Constitution vests the responsibility to go to war explicitly and exclusively in Congress, not in one person in the Oval Office. James Madison put it best in 1793 when he wrote, and I quote, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive. The trust and the temptation would be too great for any one man." End of quote. Mr. President, we are seeing Donald Trump succumb to the temptation in real time as he wantonly strikes boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. 16 strikes to date, 67 people killed, extrajudicial killings, no evidence to support their claims, and even if they were to provide evidence, still not a justification to engage the armed forces of the United States. And now the Trump administration is threatening lethal operations against Maduro and the Maduro regime in Venezuela itself. We all understand that the president has the authority to defend the United States from imminent attacks. That's an authority that this resolution clearly recognizes. But it's also crystal clear that there is no imminent attack or danger from Venezuela. Zero. Now, after illegally striking boats and killing people in international waters, President Trump is now threatening to start a war against a sovereign nation in our own hemisphere. As my colleague and friend Senator Kaine pointed out earlier, the president's been taking this series of actions that are displayed on this chart. On October 15th, Trump confirmed that he'd authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela. October 16, Trump says, "We are certainly looking at land now," meaning not only using the armed forces of the United States to strike in the waters, but on land in Venezuela. October 24th, the Pentagon announces that the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group has been directed to U.S. Southcom. October 31st, several Trump administration officials tell the press that a secret list of targets in Venezuela has been drawn up. Headline in the New York Times, Trump weighs options and risks for attacks on Venezuela. Washington Post, Trump beats the war drums for direct action in Venezuela. Mr. President, that is what people are discussing and contemplating as we speak within this administration. And it's not just this series of actions and comments that have surfaced, but the President of the United States has deployed lots of U.S. military assets to the region. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is a massive deployment of U.S. naval power off the coast of Venezuela. In other words, President Trump is openly threatening a regime change war that could cost American and Venezuelan lives. You know, I think we all agree think we all agree in this body that Maduro is a terrible dictator. He's a plague on his own people. But we have learned from history that bombs don't turn dictatorships into democracies. The American people, particularly our veterans who sacrificed so much in Afghanistan and Iraq, understand that lesson very clearly, as do the American people, because recent polling found that a majority of Americans would oppose a U.S. military invasion of Venezuela. And the U.S. Navy deployment near Venezuela has become even less popular over the last month, as the Trump administration's boat strikes and saber-rattling against Venezuela has intensified. Mr. President, I want to take a moment to contrast this resolution regarding Venezuela with the one we considered recently in the Senate regarding applying the War Powers Resolution to the President's action blowing up boats and people in international waters. And I see my colleague, Senator Kaine, on the floor, and I want to thank him for bringing both these resolutions before the body. But I wanted to mention the earlier resolution because just earlier today, I read the Trump administration's so-called justification for the actions that they are taking in international waters to strike these boats that have killed 67 people. And I have followed the war powers debate for a very long time, as have many of my colleagues. And Mr. President, what I read was 35 pages of pure gobbledygook, pure mumbo-jumbo. Clearly a lawyer who had to work really hard to justify a decision that had already been made. That's what that 35 plus whatever page report was. And as my colleague Senator Reid talked about, to justify the actions that the President's been taking about going after boats in international waters requires such a strained reading of the war powers set out in the Constitution and subsequently that it would blow up a hole so big that would essentially absorb the Article I requirement that Congress be the one that declare war. So based on my reading of that statement, there's zero justification for what the President's doing with respect to strikes in the Caribbean. I do want to point out, as of my colleagues, that if you're actually serious about preventing drugs from coming to the United States, as we all should be, the way you do it is you interdict those boats, you go up the chain to find the kingpins, and you go after them. I'll tell you what you don't do. You don't submit a budget to the United States Congress that cuts the funding for the Drug Enforcement Agency and cuts funding for the task forces we've developed to go after major organized crime syndicates involved in the drug business. I happen to be the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee that oversees the Justice Department. And all my colleagues have to do is take a look at the requests from the President of the United States when it comes to resources for fighting drugs coming to the United States. They cut them. They cut those resources. So that's not what this is about. And what this is about is a violation of the Constitution. It was just a few months ago that President Trump was asked whether he needs to uphold the Constitution of the United States. I don't know if my colleagues remember what his answer was, but it's right there in the record for all of you to read it. The President said, "I don't know. I don't know." Our job here is to make it clear to the President and to everybody else that all of us have to adhere to the Constitution of the United States. And that's what this War Powers Resolution does. If we don't want to surrender those constitutional responsibilities to the President of the United States, we need to vote for this resolution, which, as I read at the very beginning of my remarks, is very clear. It simply says the President cannot go to war against Venezuela without congressional authorization. So let me just end with this, Mr. President. We're here in the middle of a government shutdown. I have now voted 7 times to reopen the government without giving President Trump a blank check and dealing with the healthcare crisis that's in front of us. President Trump has not engaged in any way in that discussion. He's been traveling around the world. He wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, who apparently said no. He's using at least $20 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to bail out his buddy in Argentina. Meanwhile, here at home, prices are going up and up and up. The president promised he was going to bring them down on day one. Right now, before us, we have a ticking time bomb that's going to explode healthcare costs in America, especially when it comes to the Affordable Care Act. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they passed what they called was a big, beautiful bill. Beautiful if you're a billionaire, because they extended the tax cuts for billionaires permanently. The one tax relief provision that they let lapse was that helps middle-class Americans better afford their health care. So the message all of us should send to the President of the United States is quit engaging in illegal actions in the Caribbean and international waters, blowing up boats and people in an extrajudicial fashion. And when it comes to Venezuela, stop making these threats and amassing military assets off the shore and claiming you somehow have the authority to do that. The Constitution invests the authority to go to war with the United States Congress. That's what this resolution is all about. And I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield the floor.
Chair recognizes the senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this weekend I watched, probably like you, a number of folks go on television and confidently